Okay, so you want to own a luxury fashion brand. Runway shows in Paris and Milan. Celebrities fighting over front row seats. A handbag that costs more than a used car and sells out the moment it hits the shelf. You picture yourself as the creative visionary behind a name whispered with reverence at dinner parties, collecting margins that would make almost any other consumer business jealous. That's the fantasy. Here's the actual business hiding underneath it. An industry where a handbag that costs $200 to actually manufacture can retail for $3,000 to $5,000. Not because the leather is rare, but because the entire business model depends on convincing people that the price itself is the point. An industry where a single creative director's departure can tank a house's relevance overnight. Where counterfeiters manufacture more units of some brands' products than the brands themselves do. And where the difference between a beloved heritage house and a forgotten label gathering dust in outlet malls often comes down to a handful of decisions made decades before the current owner ever bought in. Some luxury fashion houses generate the kind of profit margins that make private equity firms salivate. Some collapse into irrelevance within a single generation despite a century of accumulated brand heritage. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why luxury fashion is simultaneously one of the highest margin businesses in consumer goods and one of the most fragile, reputation-dependent enterprises in the entire economy. What you're actually buying before the money makes sense. You need to understand that a luxury fashion brand is not, at its core, in the business of selling clothing or accessories. It's in the business of selling scarcity, status, and a carefully constructed story, and the physical product is simply the vessel that carries those things into a customer's home. This distinction matters enormously because it explains almost every strange-looking decision this industry makes that would be irrational in any other consumer goods business. A mass-market retailer wants every product sold, every unit moved, every warehouse emptied as efficiently as possible. A genuine luxury house frequently does the opposite on purpose, deliberately underproducing certain items, maintaining waiting lists for popular products, and in some well-documented cases, destroying unsold inventory rather than discounting it. Because a discounted luxury handbag on a clearance rack does more damage to the brand's entire value proposition than simply burning the unsold stock ever could. This is why luxury fashion houses generally fall into two structural categories. The first is the independent or family-controlled house, businesses like Chanel or Hermes, that have historically resisted outside ownership specifically to preserve creative and strategic control over decisions, like exactly how many units of a specific handbag to produce each year, that a public company's shareholders would almost certainly push toward maximizing in ways that would damage long-term brand equity. The second is the conglomerate-owned house, brands that have been acquired by one of a small handful of massive luxury holding companies, LVMH, Kering, and Richemont being the dominant players, that provide the acquired brand with shared manufacturing infrastructure, retail real estate negotiating power, and marketing resources far beyond what an independent house could access, in exchange for the brand giving up a meaningful degree of independent control for its own strategic direction. Understanding which of these two categories a given house occupies explains an enormous amount about how it's run, how fast it grows, and how vulnerable it is to the specific risks we're about to walk through. The cost of actually building the thing, launching a genuine luxury fashion house from scratch, one with real ambitions of being taken seriously as a couture or ready-to-wear brand rather than simply a premium label, requires a scale of upfront investment that surprises people who assume fashion is a business you can bootstrap with a sewing machine and a good idea. According to industry analysis from consultancies that specialize in luxury sector economics, launching a credible ready-to-wear luxury brand with genuine runway ambitions typically requires an initial investment in the range of $5 million to $20 million, plus to fund the first several collections, cover the cost of runway show production, which alone can run $500,000 to over $2 million for a single major fashion week presentation once venue rental, staging, model casting, hair and makeup teams, and press logistics are all accounted for, and sustain the business through the multi-year period before revenue reliably covers costs. Manufacturing represents a genuinely significant ongoing cost, and here's where the economics get interesting. Even at the true luxury tire, actual production costs for a garment or accessory are typically a small fraction of retail price, but achieving the specific quality standard that justifies a luxury price point, meaning genuine Italian or French artisanal manufacturing, hand-finished stitching, and materials sourced from specific tanneries and mills with decades of accumulated craft reputation, costs meaningfully more than mass-market production even before markup is applied, and securing capacity at the small number of ateliers capable of that quality level, many of which are already contractually committed to establish houses, can itself be a genuine barrier to entry for a new brand. Retail real estate represents, perhaps, the single most visible and expensive line item for any house with ambitions of operating its own flagship stores rather than selling purely through department stores and multi-brand boutiques. According to commercial real estate data tracked by firms like Cushman and Wakefield that publish annual reports on prime global retail rents, flagship retail space on the world's most prestigious luxury shopping streets, Fifth Avenue in New York, the Avenue des Champs-Élysées in Paris, and similar addresses in London and Hong Kong, commands among the highest commercial rents on the entire planet, frequently exceeding $2,000 to $3,000 per square foot annually in the very top locations, meaning a single flagship store on a marquee luxury shopping street can carry an annual rent bill running into the millions of dollars before a single product is sold. A cost that only makes sense within a business model built around extraordinarily high pride and margins. The manufacturing paradox is the detail that genuinely surprises people once they understand it, and it sits at the very center of luxury fashion economics. The gap between what a luxury item costs to physically produce and what it sells for is not primarily explained by superior materials or craftsmanship, even though both of those things are real and do add cost. It's explained by brand equity itself, a genuinely intangible asset that nonetheless drives the overwhelming majority of the final retail price. Industry analysis and reporting on luxury goods manufacturing costs has repeatedly estimated that the actual cost of materials and labor to produce an iconic luxury handbag, the kind of instantly recognizable style that anchors a house's entire product line, often represents somewhere in the range of 10 to 20% of its final retail price, meaning a handbag retailing for $3,000 to $5,000 might cost the house somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 to $800 to physically manufacture, even accounting for genuinely high-quality leather and skilled artisanal labor. This is not a scandal or a secret the industry is desperate to hide. It's the fundamental mechanism by which luxury fashion generates the extraordinary gross margins that make it one of the most profitable categories in all of consumer goods. And according to financial disclosures from the publicly traded luxury conglomerates, gross margins at the strongest luxury houses commonly run 65 to 75%, figures that would be considered extraordinary in almost any other consumer products category and that reflect the reality that customers are not primarily paying for the cost of materials. They're paying for the accumulated cultural weight of the brand's history, its exclusivity, and the specific meaning that carrying that particular logo communicates to everyone who sees it. This is precisely why counterfeiting represents such a genuinely existential threat to this industry in a way it simply doesn't for, say, a car manufacturer or a food company. If the actual manufacturing cost of the product were the primary driver of its value, a convincing counterfeit wouldn't meaningfully threaten the brand, since a functionally similar bag could theoretically be produced by anyone with comparable materials and skill. But because the value is overwhelmingly located in the brand itself rather than the physical object, a widely circulating counterfeit doesn't just steal a single sale. It dilutes the scarcity and exclusivity that the entire premium price depends on, which is exactly why luxury houses spend genuinely enormous sums on anti-counterfeiting enforcement, including dedicated legal teams, private investigators, and active partnerships with customs authorities worldwide specifically to seize counterfeit shipments before they ever reach a consumer. The bill that never stops arriving running an established luxury fashion house, even a genuinely successful and profitable one, involves several categories of ongoing expense that most people watching a glamorous runway show broadcast never think about. Runway shows themselves, produced 2-4 times a year for a major house running separate menswear, womenswear, and pre-collection presentations, represent a recurring, substantial marketing expense with no direct guaranteed return. Since a runway show doesn't sell product directly to the audience watching it, it sells a story to press, retail buyers, and increasingly, to a global social media audience watching a live stream. And the production costs for these presentations, particularly for the houses competing at the very top of the calendar in Paris and Milan, have escalated considerably as houses compete to produce increasingly elaborate sets and celebrity-studded front rows specifically to generate the media coverage and social media engagement that now functions as a huge share of the brand's total marketing value. Retail operations represent another enormous, continuous cost category, and unlike a mass-market retailer that can run relatively lean, standardized stores, a luxury flagship requires extensively trained sales staff capable of providing the kind of personalized, relationship-driven service that justifies the price point, meaning staffing costs per square foot run considerably higher than typical retail, on top of the extraordinary rent figures already discussed, and the stores themselves require frequent, expensive renovation and redesign cycles to maintain the aspirational, immaculate physical presentation that luxury retail depends on. Creative talent represents a genuinely significant and increasingly volatile cost category. A creative director at a major house, the individual ultimately responsible for the brand's entire aesthetic direction each season, commands a compensation package that can run into the millions of dollars annually at the industry's top tier, and beyond direct salary. Houses invest heavily in the broader creative and design team required to execute a creative director's vision across dozens of product categories every season. Marketing and brand ambassador spending has become an enormous and increasingly necessary cost category as social media has reshaped how luxury brands reach customers. And according to reporting on luxury industry marketing spend, celebrity and influencer partnership deals at the top tier of the industry can run into the tens of millions of dollars annually for a single house's portfolio of ambassador relationships, a cost that has risen considerably as the value of a celebrity's social media following has become an increasingly central part of how luxury brands calculate marketing return on investment. How the money actually comes back. Revenue architecture of a genuinely successful luxury fashion house reveals something that surprises people who assume the runway clothing itself is where the real money gets made. According to financial disclosures from publicly traded luxury conglomerates, the actual runway ready-to-wear collections, the extraordinarily expensive, meticulously crafted pieces that generate the press coverage and define a house's creative identity each season, frequently represent a relatively modest share of total revenue, often less than 10% at many major houses, while the overwhelming majority of actual revenue comes from what the industry sometimes calls accessible luxury, handbags, small leather goods, footwear, and increasingly, licensed fragrance and cosmetics lines. This is the central commercial insight that has quietly reshaped the entire industry over the past several decades. The runway show and the extraordinarily expensive couture or ready-to-wear pieces function primarily as a marketing and brand-building exercise, generating the press coverage, the celebrity association, and the cultural cachet that then gets monetized through a much wider, much more accessible product tier that a considerably larger number of customers can actually afford. A $5,000 handbag might be genuinely aspirational for a customer earning a solid but unremarkable income, but it's an achievable aspirational purchase in a way that a $30,000 haute couture gown simply isn't, meaning the handbag category, along with fragrance, cosmetics, and smaller leather goods like wallets and card cases, functions as the volume driver that generates the majority of actual profit, while the Runway collection functions as the brand-building engine that makes customers want to own something, anything, with that specific name attached to it. Fragrance and cosmetics licensing deserves particular attention here because it operates under a genuinely different economic model than the core fashion business. Many luxury houses license their name to specialized beauty conglomerates like L'Oreal or Coty to actually manufacture and distribute fragrance and cosmetics products under the luxury brand's name, in exchange for licensing royalties, typically running in the range of 5 to 10% of wholesale and revenue according to industry licensing analysis, a structure that allows the fashion house to capture meaningful revenue from a genuinely mass-market product category. Fragrance being sold at price points accessible to a vastly larger customer base than any handbag or ready-to-wear garment, without having to build out the specialized chemical manufacturing and mass retail distribution infrastructure that beauty products require, infrastructure that operates on a fundamentally different scale and skill set than fashion manufacturing. The volatility nobody wants to talk about despite the extraordinary margins available at the top of this industry. Luxury fashion carries a genuinely unusual set of risks that can destroy decades of accumulated brand value with startling speed. The most distinctive risk in this entire industry is creative director volatility, and it has no real parallel in most other consumer businesses, because a house's entire aesthetic identity and cultural relevance is often tied intensely to a single individual's creative vision. The departure of a beloved creative director, whether by their own choice, a contract dispute, or a controversy, can trigger an immediate and sometimes prolonged decline in the brand's cultural relevance and sales performance, and finding a successor who can maintain or reignite that same cultural energy is a genuinely unpredictable process that has, at various points across the industry's recent history, taken several attempts and several years to get right at more than one major house. Reputational risk operates with a speed and severity in luxury fashion that few other industries experience, precisely because the entire business model depends on an aspirational, carefully curated brand image, meaning a single controversy, whether a designer's personal conduct, an advertising campaign perceived as tone-deaf or offensive, or documented labor and supply chain issues at manufacturing partners, can trigger immediate, substantial reputational damage and consumer boycotts that mass-market brands, whose customers are generally purchasing based on price and utility rather than aspirational identity, are considerably more insulated from. Consumer spending cyclicality represents a third genuine risk, since luxury goods purchases are, almost by definition, discretionary spending that customers can and do pull back on considerably during economic downturns. And according to industry analysis tracking luxury sector performance through recent economic cycles, luxury goods sales have shown meaningfully more volatility during recessions and periods of economic uncertainty than staple consumer goods categories, a dynamic that has been particularly pronounced in recent years given how much of the industry's growth over the past 2 decades has depended specifically on rising affluent consumer spending in China, meaning any meaningful slowdown in Chinese luxury consumption, whether from broader economic conditions or shifts in government policy toward conspicuous consumption, can meaningfully affect the entire industry's growth trajectory in a way that simply wasn't true when luxury fashion's customer base was more heavily concentrated in Europe and North America. And then there is counterfeiting, a genuinely massive parallel economy that operates alongside the legitimate luxury industry. According to estimates from organizations that track global counterfeit trade, counterfeit luxury goods represent a market valued in the tens of billions of dollars annually worldwide. And beyond the direct lost sales this represents, the sheer prevalence of convincing counterfeits in certain markets can genuinely erode the exclusivity and status value that the entire legitimate luxury price structure depends on, since part of what a customer is paying for is the confidence that owning the genuine article signals something specific and verifiable to others, a signal that becomes considerably less valuable when convincing fakes are widely circulating. The real case study. Gucci under Tom Ford and the cost of what comes after. Understand both how dramatically a creative vision can transform a struggling luxury house and how fragile that transformation can prove once the specific individual behind it departs. Look at what happened to Gucci across the 1990s and into the 2000s. Gucci entered the 1990s as a genuinely troubled house, widely reported at the time to be suffering from brand dilution after a period of aggressive licensing that had put the Gucci name on a wide range of lower-quality products, diminishing the exclusivity that luxury branding fundamentally depends on. Combined with a public and damaging family ownership dispute among members of the Gucci family that generated exactly the kind of negative press attention that luxury brands are specifically vulnerable to. The house brought in Tom Ford as creative director in 1994, and over the following several years, Ford executed what is widely regarded within the fashion industry as one of the most dramatic and commercially successful brand turnarounds in modern luxury history, repositioning Gucci around a specific, provocative, unmistakably modern aesthetic that generated enormous press attention and re-established the house as one of the most culturally relevant names in fashion. And according to financial reporting from that period, Gucci's revenue grew substantially during Ford's tenure, transforming the company from a struggling, dilution-damaged house into one of the most commercially successful and critically acclaimed luxury businesses of its era, a turnaround significant enough that it directly enabled the Gucci Group to become an attractive acquisition target and eventually a cornerstone asset of what became the Kering luxury conglomerate. But when Tom Ford departed the house in 2004, following a dispute with new ownership over creative control, Gucci faced a genuinely difficult multi-year period finding a successor who could maintain the specific cultural momentum Ford had built. And industry analysis at the time widely noted the challenge of following an era so intensely defined by one individual's singular creative vision, a challenge that took the house years and multiple creative director transitions to fully navigate, before the house eventually found renewed cultural momentum under a subsequent creative direction years later. The Gucci story under Ford, and the years of recalibration that followed his departure, is one of the clearest illustrations in the entire industry of the core structural risk we've been describing, the same intense, personality-driven creative vision that can transform a struggling, dilution-damaged house into one of the most valuable and culturally dominant brands in the world is also a genuinely fragile asset, one that walks out the door with the individual who built it, leaving the business to spend years and enormous resources trying to recapture a specific cultural energy that, by its very nature, resists being manufactured on demand. To scenarios, let's build the honest math the way an actual owner has to run it. In the good scenario, you own a luxury fashion house with a genuinely stable creative direction, strong brand heritage, and a well-balanced product portfolio across handbags, accessories, and a licensed fragrance line, positioned within a major conglomerate that provides shared manufacturing efficiency and negotiating power on prime retail real estate. Annual revenue for a mid-sized, but genuinely established house in this position might run $500 million to $1.5 billion, with accessories and leather goods representing the majority share, fragrance licensing contributing steady, high-margin royalty income, and the Runway ready-to-wear collection functioning as the brand-building engine rather than the primary profit driver, at a gross margin in the 65 to 70% range and disciplined control over the marketing, retail, and creative talent costs discussed earlier. A well-run house at this scale can generate genuinely exceptional operating margins, often in the range of 20 to 25% of revenue, figures that would be the envy of almost any other consumer products category, and brand value that continues appreciating as long as cultural relevance and creative direction remain stable. Now the harder scenario. Your house's beloved, culturally dominant creative director departs unexpectedly following a public dispute, and the replacement's first several collections fail to generate the same press excitement or retail beer enthusiasm, triggering a meaningful decline in both the brand-building Runway business and, more damagingly, in the accessible luxury handbag and accessories lines that depend on customers wanting to be associated with whatever cultural energy the house currently represents. Simultaneously, a slowdown in Chinese luxury consumption, driven by broader economic conditions in one of the industry's most important growth markets over the past 2 decades, further pressures accessories and handbag sales, specifically in one of your largest and previously fastest-growing markets. Your fixed costs, the flagship retail leases on the world's most expensive shopping streets, the creative and design team salaries, the celebrity ambassador contracts signed during better times, don't meaningfully decrease even as revenue softens, and you find yourself spending several years and considerable additional marketing investment simply trying to re-establish the cultural relevance that used to arrive largely on its own. The gap between these two scenarios in a modest adjustment to a forecast. It's the difference between one of the highest margin businesses in all of consumer goods and a multi-year, expensive scramble to rebuild an asset, cultural relevance, that by its very nature cannot simply be purchased back at any price. The real payoff, the difference between luxury fashion houses that build lasting, multi-generational wealth and those that quietly fade into irrelevance despite decades of accumulated heritage, comes down to a small number of disciplined choices that run directly counter to the instincts of almost every other consumer goods business, protecting scarcity, sometimes at the direct expense of short-term revenue, by resisting the temptation to overproduce popular items or expand into product categories that dilute the brand's exclusivity, has proven again and again to be the difference between a house that maintains pricing power for generations and one that slowly discounts its way into irrelevance. Building institutional creative continuity, meaning a house's aesthetic identity that can survive the transition between individual creative directors, rather than being so singularly tied to one person's vision that the entire business risks collapsing the moment they leave, has become one of the central strategic priorities for the industry's most durable houses over the past several decades, and balancing the Runway's brand-building function against the accessible luxury categories that actually generate the majority of profit. Understanding clearly which part of the business is the marketing engine and which part is the profit engine, and resourcing each appropriately rather than confusing the two, separates houses that thrive across multiple decades from those that either overspend on runway spectacle without a commercial engine to support it, or underinvest in the creative energy that makes customers want the accessible product line in the first place. The romance of the runway, the celebrities, the exclusivity, the craftsmanship, is genuinely real, and it's precisely that romance, carefully protected and never taken for granted, that generates some of the highest profit margins in all of consumer goods. Which means the honest answer to whether owning a luxury fashion brand can make you extraordinarily wealthy is yes, unambiguously, among the most profitable consumer businesses that exist. But the houses that sustain that wealth across generations are the ones that understand the product was never really the handbag or the dress. It was always the story, and the story, unlike a factory or a flagship store, can evaporate in a single bad season if nobody is disciplined enough to protect it. And subscribe Alma Discover for more videos. Thank you.